The Berlin Airlift, or Operation Vittles as it's affectionately known, begins with a simple phone call where a simple question is asked and a simple answer given. But before I share with you what was said, I'd like to add some historical background to enhance understanding and appreciation of why these very simple words will make all the difference in a desperate situation. In accordance with the World War II surrender agreement, Germany is to be divided into 4 sectors to be occupied by the 4 allies, Americans, British, French, Russians, effective June 5th, 1945. To give you an idea of what this looks like, I do have a color-coded map. The red represents the Soviet sector. It will become known as East Germany. On the other side, we have the British in green, French in blue, Americans in orange. These sectors will become known as West Germany. Berlin, the capital of Germany, is to be divided and occupied as well. But what becomes known as East and West Berlin presents a special problem. West Berlin is located deep within the Soviet zone. It's more than 100 miles from West Berlin to the West German border. And at that time, there are no authorized travel ground roads between West and West. So West Berlin is like a tiny island surrounded by East Berlin and all of East Germany. Therefore, those living there, the West Berliners, Americans, and Allies, are dependent upon the Russian goodwill and generosity for everyday food and fuel supplies. And so far, so good. But in the spring of 1948, the Americans, French, and British decide to unite their sectors and introduce a new currency called the Deutsche Mark. This is to get the economy going again after the long years of war. The Russians retaliate with the Berlin blockade. At exactly 6 a.m. on June 24th, 1948, the Russians literally shut down every entrance going into West Berlin. Roads, rail, waterway. No food, no fuel, no nothing. And the excuse the Russians give is classic: due to technical difficulties. The Russian objective is to starve and force the Americans and Allies out of West Berlin for good, hopefully the rest of Germany, and open up Europe for further communist expansion. The Allies quickly calculate they have enough food for 36 days, fuel for 45. And while it may be impossible to get provisions over land from West Germany, the Allies do have 3 20-mile wide air corridors from west to west. The $90,000 question is, can they fly in the estimated 1,500 tons of food, not to mention the 3,000 tons of fuel needed for everyday living in West Berlin? To find out, General Lucius Clay, commander of the American sector in West Berlin, calls General Curtis LeMay, commander of the newly founded United States Air Force. It's barely 6 months old, but it's filled with World War II veterans from the Army Air Corps. those with plenty of know-how and experience to handle any crisis, including this one. General Clay asks, can the Air Force haul coal? General LeMay answers, the Air Force can haul anything. This simple 6-word response quickly becomes a favorite, famous military quote of all time. To show the Air Force can do it, within 2 days, 32 C-47 cargo transport planes fly into Tempelhof Air Base, West Berlin, bringing in 80 tons of food and fuel, including coal. But it's anyone's guess how long the Berlin blockade will last. So, LeMay appoints a General William Tunner to take command of what becomes known as the Berlin Airlift / Operation Vittles. Tunner is a natural. He spent most of World War II in the South Pacific, flying in supplies for the China-Burma-India campaign. Willie the Whip, as he quickly becomes known, institutes new, radical, strict, precise air traffic procedures, transforming the Berlin Airlift into a meticulous, first-class operation. Planes take off every 3 minutes with 500 feet intervals between them. Pilots are to fly into West Berlin at precisely 170 miles per hour, no more, no less. They are to fly by instruments and instruments only, and obey every order given them by the air traffic controllers. The planes land in Tempelhof every 3 minutes and are directed to an area to unload. 30 minutes is all that's allowed for this process. In a few months, General Tunner will replace the C-47 with the Douglas C-54 Skymaster. Not only can the C-54 haul more tonnage, this aircraft is level, not slanted down like the C-47. Trucks can back right up to the cargo hold, unload in half the time. To keep the planes flying continuously around the clock, the Americans used the Southern Air Corridor out of Rhine-Main in West Germany, while the British and additional Americans used the Northern Air Corridor out of Lübeck in West Germany. After landing in Tempelhof, West Berlin, and unloading, everyone uses the Central Air Corridor to fly back to West Germany and their respective bases. It's in the air corridors where the pilots are in the most danger. At night, the Russians just love shining huge searchlights into the airspace, trying to blind the pilots, get them off course. The Russians also, accidentally on purpose, allow weather balloons to drift over into the air corridors, hoping to damage the planes. Then some pilots begin reporting. Russian fighters are crossing over into the corridors and flying straight at them, that old game of chicken. General Tunner reiterates his orders. You are to stay at 170 miles per hour. You don't maneuver left, right, up, down. You certainly don't turn around and come back. You stay the course. One afternoon, a young naval pilot, Earl Moore, detects a Russian fighter coming at him at 500 miles per hour. The Allied planes are not armed. They have no way to defend themselves. So there is that temptation to get out of there. But being the well-trained professional pilot he is, Earl stays at the correct speed and on course. And sure enough, as the other pilots have reported, the Russian pulls up at the very last minute. Only this time, he takes the C-54 radio antenna with him. It was that close. The heart and soul and backbone of the airlift are the ground crews, the mechanics. It's their job to keep the aircraft ready to go at all times, and they're out there on the flight lines and in the hangars 24/7 in every kind of weather imaginable. So in addition to food and fuel, aircraft components, including whole engines, are also being stockpiled. The mechanics inspect the planes before they take off, when they return from Tempelhof, and they perform 24-hour maintenance checks. They become experts at spotting any problem and being able to change a component out, including a whole engine, in a minimum amount of time. The biggest threat to the Berlin airlift is the German climate. I can tell you this is true as I spent 5 years over there. I never saw blizzards, ice storms, and especially fog. It frightened me the most. The fog is like a thick pea soup, and I can still remember going to work, hopefully at 5 miles an hour, hoping not to hit anyone in front of me, let alone go off the road. General Tunner is also aware of the German weather, and he's already been forewarned. It's predicted that a very harsh winter is coming for 48-49. So, Tunner sends for all the latest, best weather technical equipment he can get. Has it installed at all the installations. He also requires weather reports every half hour on the half hour from ships at sea, U.S. weather stations around the world, including the Arctic. By the time that harsh winter shows up, the airlifters are more than ready. And one of the things they do on a good weather flying day, in addition to the aircraft already scheduled, they'll try and add in a whole lot more, all that they can, to compensate on a bad weather day when they can't get out as many. The ones who really suffer that winter are the West Germans. They're living mostly on dried potatoes, powdered eggs, small cans of meat, and they're allowed 4 and only 4 hours of electricity a day. But not one of them starves or freezes to death. And this is where we praise the British. They came in ahead of those winter months, and with the help of the local population, they round up all the homeless individuals, and especially all the orphan children living on the street without parents, without homes, with nowhere to go. They're all flown back to West Germany. The children are placed in orphanages where hopefully they will be adopted. The Russians end the Berlin blockade on May 12, 1949, but nobody trusts the Russians anymore. So it's decided the airlift will continue with the idea to keep on stockpiling in case they pull this again. The last plane to land in Tempelhof Air Base, West Berlin, and unload cargo is on September 30th, 1949. The nearly 300,000 flights in the Berlin airlift have brought in just under 2.5 million tons of food and fuel, including coal. The Berlin airlift did cost 31 American and 39 British lives. They are remembered today. Their names are engraved on the Berlin Airlift Memorial located at Tempelhof Air Base. And while the largest, greatest humanitarian airlift in history is over, it leaves an astounding legacy, one that still shines today. This is the one and only air battle in history to be won without firing a single shot. This is a battle that gives a city, a country, and an entire continent the courage to fight communism. And it's a battle that forever endears the West Berliners to the Americans and Allies. And as one of America's greatest military achievements, it sends a clear message. Don't mess with the United States Air Force. Like all conflicts, the airlift brings us extraordinary heroes. Here's a few that I believe will be remembered forever. Brand new Air Force Second Lieutenant Gale Halverson takes his first paycheck and goes and buys himself a brand new red shiny 4-door Chevrolet. He's even lucky enough to have a few dates with it before getting orders for the Berlin airlift. Not knowing how long the conflict will last, Gale is forced to sell the automobile. But something far more worthwhile is about to take the place of that memory of that first special car. After serving in the airlift for a few weeks, Gale decides he would like to explore West Berlin on the ground. So on his next day off, he hitches a ride with a crew going into Tempelhof. The first thing he sees when he leaves the hangar are a group of children up the hill behind the barbed wire, intently watching the planes land, unload, and take off. Thinking he can have some conversation with them, Gale strolls up the hill, offers a big hello. It turns out 4 of the children speak English reasonably well, having learned some in school. And as they chit-chat back and forth, this strikes Gale as very odd. These aren't like the World War II children he remembers, who would come up to him and anyone in a uniform asking for chewing gum and chocolate, the treats that used to come in the C rations and K rations. Instead, they keep thanking him over and over, and as well the rest of the airlifters, for bringing in food and not letting them starve, for the extra clothing, and especially for not abandoning them to the Russians, who will take their freedom. These are just children, yet they understand what's going on here, what the situation is, what's at stake. And that leaves Gale wishing he did have a treat for them. So he searches his pockets, finds 2 pieces of Wrigley's Spearmint chewing gum. Hoping it won't cause any problems, Gale divides the gum between the 4 children he was speaking with. But he needn't have worried. These children also shared. They take the wrapper and the foil, and they tear it into little strips, passing that to the other kids, who are filled with joy just smelling the wrapper and the foil. That's when Gale decides these children are getting some candy. So he tells them, tomorrow when I fly in, I'm going to drop you all some goodies. but you have to promise me, whoever catches it, you will share with everyone. The response is a great big jawohl. But how will we know it's you? When I see you, I will wiggle the aircraft wings. Then you'll see the candy come out. When Gale returns to Rhine, Maine, he gets with his co-pilot and engineer and discusses the situation with them. They've seen these children and they have no problem with it. So they pull their ration cards, go get all the goodies they can. Then they make parachutes out of handkerchiefs and attach the candy to it so that it will float down. They also make a sacred pact. This comes under that heading of it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. Gale just knew if he did go through the correct channels, there would be all this red tape, the answer would probably be no anyway, and he's already promised these children. So they will do this once and only once and never again, and never ever tell another soul. The next afternoon, when Gale sees the children as he flies in, he wiggles the wings, cues the engineer to throw the candy out of the flare chutes. On the ground, Gale and the crew are anxious to get back in the air, see if their plan worked. When they see the children jumping up and down with the parachutes, not to mention the mouths chewing away at the chewing gum, chocolate, and all the other treats, they're overwhelmed. So of course, they don't do it just once. The candy drop becomes a weekly routine with them. And I do have a picture here I would like to share. This is Gale throwing the parachutes with candy out of the aircraft for the children. Then one day when in Tempelhof, Gale decides to go into the hangar to get a weather map. What he sees nearly gives him cardiac arrest. There's a table stacked with letters addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings and the Chocolat Pilot. Forget the weather map. When they're back in the air, it's, you're not going to believe what was in there. We can never do this again. We are really going to get it. Well, look, nobody knows we did it. We never told anyone. We stopped now. It'll die down. But every time they fly into Tempelhof and they see those little faces looking up for the right plane that's going to give them some goodies, they start the candy operation back up again. Then one day, when Gale lands back at Rhine, Maine, 2 military policemen are there to escort him to see his commanding officer. Once inside the office, Gale snaps to attention, salutes. The CO says, "Halverson, what have you been doing?" "Flying like mad, sir." "Yeah, I mean, what else have you been doing? Because I have a German newspaper article here. Seems there were rumors going around West Berlin that a pilot was dropping off candy for children every time he flies into Tempelhof. They sent a reporter to check it out. He nearly got hit in the head with a parachute with candy attached as he was writing down your tail number. And I've been getting calls from all my fellow officers, including our commanding officer, General Tunner, congratulating me for coming up with what has to be the most ingenious, brilliant public relations idea of the century. By the way, he is ordering you to continue dropping the candy. You are to encourage other pilots to do it as well, and he's calling it Operation Little Vittles. So instead of the court-martial Gale is expecting, He's now free to pass out all the candy he likes. And Tunner does capitalize on this idea. On his days off, Gail is sent to visit hospitals to give candy to children there who can't make it to the flight line. Other children in West Berlin send Gail their addresses since they can't make it to Tempelhof. One little boy is very specific. I live at the end of this lane. My house is blue. My mailbox is metal. These are the street names, and I'll be out in the backyard to catch the candy at 2:30 p.m. Gail takes each and every address, wraps up a package of treats, sends it back to those children through the mail. It didn't end there. The story reaches the States. Candy corporations start sending over all kinds of goodies, while clothing companies send over handkerchiefs for the parachutes. Brief overview of what I've given you about the Berlin Airlift. There is a whole lot more to it. So I do recommend looking up two websites, the Berlin Airlift Association and the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. Both have excellent pictures, accounts, stories, history, everything you could ever want to know. And if you ever find yourself in Berlin, be sure and go and visit the Allied Museum. It has wonderful artifacts from the Berlin Airlift, including some of Gail Halvorson's handkerchief parachutes. And by the way, it's the same building where Red Hot and Blockaded was performed. Thanks for listening to today's presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm done.